Let us begin at the root of it all, not the barn, not the act itself, but the idea that allowed it to happen. The idea that human flesh could hold value beyond its being, that a body could be weighed not in soul, but in use. In the 1840s South, the worth of a person was measured by what they could produce, how they appeared, and how they could serve. The plantation lady lived inside that illusion, the cruel mathematics of ownership that turned people into instruments of her will. Yet when her own daughter's body began to betray that illusion, soft, swollen, and heavy with the weight of overindulgence, it became a new kind of problem. The body that should have symbolized her wealth now symbolized her shame. And in her desperation to restore control, she did what the powerful have always done when the illusion begins to break. She sacrificed someone else to preserve it. The South, by that time, was a civilization built not just on land and labor, but on a philosophy of flesh. Every body on a plantation was part of an economy. Every curve, every scar, every heartbeat. Even the body of a white woman, who should have been above such transactions, was not truly free from that system. She too was a product of the plantation's unspoken code, to maintain appearances, to uphold dominance, to embody perfection. When her daughter's body failed to meet those ideals, it became a kind of blasphemy. The mother's rage was not just personal, it was cultural. Her daughter's obesity contradicted everything she had been taught about control. Control over image, control over appetite, control over others. So when she offered her daughter to the 3 enslaved men, it was not merely an act of cruelty. It was a ritual, a twisted reenactment of the very logic that defined her world. The enslaved men, the daughter, and even the mother herself were all trapped in that ritual. Each of them was being used, each a piece in a larger pattern of human degradation. It is tempting to see the plantation lady as a monster, but she was something more chilling. She was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when power divorces itself from compassion, when the soul becomes an accountant of flesh. You see, sin in that time was not seen as sin if it was performed under the banner of ownership. The mother believed that her wealth granted her moral exemption, and in that belief, she revealed the fundamental sickness of the age, the confusion of dominion with divinity. The plantation culture taught her that control over another's body was a sign of superiority, almost a sign of blessing. She began to think of herself as a kind of god, the giver of punishment, the arbiter of shame. And like every false god, she demanded sacrifice. But look closely, and you'll see that her daughter's body was not the only one on the altar. Her own humanity was there, burning beside it. The act did not purify her legacy, it poisoned it. Because every time a human being treats another as a tool for their own order, something sacred dies within them. That is the cost of cruelty. It destroys not only the victim but the one who commands it. The plantation lady may have believed she was reasserting control, but what she truly did was expose her own enslavement, not to men or chains, but to the lie of power itself. Her daughter, too, was trapped by that same lie. In a world that worshipped beauty, restraint, and obedience, her body became rebellion without intent. She did not know that her very existence was an accusation against the empire her mother built. The mother could not bear it. She could not accept that her child's body, once an extension of her prestige, had become the symbol of her failure. So she turned to the logic she knew best, the plantation logic, where all problems could be solved through dominance. The result was inevitable, because cruelty is the only language power understands when it is afraid. And what of the enslaved men? They stood as the silent witnesses to a tragedy greater than any one of them could articulate. They were commanded to participate, to become instruments of another's madness. Yet within them burned the most painful truth, that they, who were owned and broken, were being used to break another. That night in the barn was not just an act of violence. It was a portrait of the entire South. Everyone trapped, everyone tainted, everyone bleeding in silence. When we speak of history, we often look for heroes and villains, clean lines and simple stories. But the truth of this story, like the truth of slavery itself, is far more uncomfortable. It was not sustained merely by the evil of a few. It was sustained by the silence of many, by the moral blindness of a society that believed possession could replace empathy. The plantation lady's actions were horrifying, yes, but they were also a symptom, a fever breaking through the skin of a civilization already diseased. And this is where the weight of sin becomes clear. It does not rest only on the victims, nor only on the perpetrators. It settles upon the entire structure that allows it to thrive. The culture that applauds control, the religion that blesses inequality, the economy that feeds on suffering. Her daughter's body was only one casualty of a much greater hunger, the hunger of a world that consumed others to feel powerful. If there is a lesson to take from that barn, it is this: every time we value power over compassion, every time we measure worth in utility instead of humanity, we resurrect that same spirit of the plantation. It may wear different clothes today, but the sickness remains the same, because in the end, the plantation lady did not offer her daughter to the enslaved men. She offered her soul to the illusion of control, and she lost it. And that is what happens, my friends, when the weight of sin becomes the currency of flesh. The barn, at first glance, just a structure of wood and nails, the heart of a plantation's labor, a place for feed for animals, for tools. But on that night, it became something else entirely. A chamber of reckoning, where all the hypocrisies of the southern world came to bear their weight upon the souls within it. History often describes the grand halls of the South, its marble foyers, its chandeliers, its manicured gardens. But the truth of its moral landscape was found not in those glittering places, but in spaces like that barn, where the unseen acts occurred, where silence became the witness, and where the illusion of gentility dissolved into raw cruelty. The barn was the plantation's shadow, everything that could not be spoken, hidden behind wooden walls. It was the unlit side of the empire. And on that night, when the plantation lady ordered her obese daughter to be taken there, it became something more than a setting. It became a symbol. It was the stage upon which the entire Southern conscience played out its drama. Power against shame, dominance against humanity, appearance against truth. Inside that barn, no one was innocent. The air itself was heavy, not just with heat or the smell of straw, but with the weight of generations of silence. The enslaved men who stood there had spent their lives obeying orders, surviving by submission. Their own was slowly worn down by the daily demand to perform obedience. The daughter stood before them, trembling, not just from fear, but from the humiliation of being reduced to an object of her mother's rage. And above them all, unseen yet omnipresent, was the spirit of the plantation lady, the architect of the scene, watching not with love but with the cold satisfaction of control. The barn in that moment was no longer a place. It was a philosophy made visible. It was what happens when a society builds itself on domination and then pretends that domination is virtue. The lady had turned it into a sanctuary of power where the rules of morality were suspended because ownership had taken their place. And so, what occurred inside those walls was not a random act of cruelty. It was the logical conclusion of everything that the plantation world believed in. The belief that one person's comfort could be built upon another's pain. The belief that dignity was a privilege, not a right. To understand that night is to understand the nature of dehumanization. It doesn't begin with whips or chains. It begins with language, with small compromises, with the slow decay of empathy. By the time you have reduced someone to property, you have already reduced yourself to something less than human. The lady had long since crossed that threshold, and the barn was her altar, a place to reenact her supremacy in its most unfiltered form. But what makes the barn so haunting is not only what happened inside, but what it revealed about everyone involved. The enslaved men, stripped of agency, were forced to bear the unbearable, to participate in a degradation that further enslaved their spirits. The daughter, whose body had long been the object of ridicule and disgust in her mother's eyes, now became a vessel for punishment. She was not offered to those men out of desire or even vengeance, but as an act of erasure, a way for the mother to destroy the reflection of her own moral failure. And the barn became a kind of grotesque confessional, where everyone's pain was made manifest, yet no one was allowed to speak. The deeper horror of that space lies in its silence. Because after the act, there was no scream, no storm, no confrontation, only stillness, And that silence speaks louder than anything else. It tells us that cruelty, when normalized, no longer shocks. It becomes routine. The plantation's greatest crime was not its violence. It was its quiet acceptance of that violence as order. The barn was merely the physical expression of that acceptance, an isolated place where the truth could happen as long as it stayed hidden. And yet, what was hidden there never truly stayed buried, because every act of cruelty, no matter how secret, leaves a stain. The barn became haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of what humans become when they strip others of their humanity. Its walls absorbed more than sweat and sound. They absorbed guilt, the kind that doesn't wash off, the kind that seeps into generations. You can almost imagine the morning after, the sun rising over the fields, the world continuing as if nothing had happened, the enslaved men returning to their labor silent, the daughter confined to her room, shamed into invisibility, the lady standing on her veranda, serene, composed, believing she had restored order. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the barn stood as a reminder that order maintained by fear is no order at all. It is rot disguised as beauty. That is what makes the barn a theater, because it performed the illusion of control while staging the collapse of everything the plantation believed about itself. The lady thought she had asserted her dominance, but she had only exposed her corruption. The enslaved men thought they had lost more of their humanity, but in truth, they bore witness to the truth she could no longer see, and the daughter, humiliated, broken, silenced, became the unspoken conscience of the land. If you listen closely to history, you can still hear the echoes of that barn, the creak of its beams, the breath of its ghosts, the whisper of its shame. It stands not only as a memory of one family's cruelty, but as a monument to the consequences of unchecked power. Every empire, every system built on control, has its barn, a place where its true nature is revealed, stripped of polish, stripped of lies. And so the question is not what happened in that barn. The question is what happens in us when we ignore the barns of our own time, the hidden places where dignity is traded for dominance, where silence becomes complicity. Because the truth is this: the barn was never just theirs. It is ours too, if we fail to see how easily power, when worshipped long enough, turns every human heart into a theater of dehumanization. The daughter's body became a symbol long before it became a tragedy. In that house, in that time, a woman's worth was measured by her appearance, her grace, her slenderness, her ability to be displayed as a reflection of her family's order. The South called it refinement, but it was vanity dressed in velvet. When the plantation lady's daughter began to grow heavy, her body became a quiet rebellion against that illusion of perfection. She was not beautiful by the standards her mother worshipped, and in the cruel arithmetic of that society, that made her less than valuable. But the deeper truth is this: her body was not simply heavy with flesh, it was heavy with the consequences of a decaying civilization. She carried, without understanding it, the physical weight of a system that had been feeding on human suffering for generations. In many ways, she embodied the South itself, indulgent, proud, and yet secretly rotting from within. The wealth that surrounded her had been built on exploitation, and so every luxury she consumed came with invisible blood in it. The lavish meals, the rich fabrics, the endless servants attending to her comfort. All of it came at the cost of someone else's exhaustion. And so her obesity was more than a personal condition. It was the physical manifestation of a society that could not stop consuming even as it destroyed itself. Her mother saw in her daughter's body not just fat, but failure, the failure to uphold the illusion that the plantation world was strong, pure, and divinely ordered. What the mother could not understand was that the daughter's body had become a mirror of the moral weight she herself refused to bear. Every pound of flesh spoke the truth her family tried to hide, that indulgence without compassion leads to decay. The daughter's isolation, her shame, and her silence were not her own doing, they were inherited burdens. In a world where appearance was everything, she was the evidence that beauty and cruelty could not coexist forever. The tragedy of her life was that she was not allowed to be human. To her mother, she was a symbol of embarrassment. To the slaves, she was an extension of the master's house, and to herself, she was an unspeakable contradiction. both powerful and powerless, privileged and imprisoned. Her body, large and unmanageable, became a battlefield for everyone else's expectations. It represented the tension between a world built on control and a body that refused to conform to it. That was her greatest sin in her mother's eyes. Not that she disobeyed, but that she existed outside the design. The plantation lady's entire identity rested on the appearance of control. Her house was ordered, her servants disciplined, her garden perfect. And then there was her daughter, who stood as a living refutation of all that order. In her mind, the daughter's body was an accusation. It asked questions she could not answer. What happens when your own blood no longer fits the image you've built? What happens when the perfection you impose on others collapses in your own home? That is why the mother's cruelty reached such extremes. She believed that if she could dominate her daughter's body, humiliate it, punish it, erase it, she could restore her illusion of power. But what she was really fighting was decay, not of flesh, but of the idea that power could sanctify sin. The more she tried to discipline that body, the more it resisted. The more she tried to control the image, the more grotesque her control became. And in the end, she did not destroy her daughter's shame, she magnified her own. This is the psychology of collapse. When a civilization begins to rot, it projects its decay onto the most vulnerable. The South projected its moral corruption onto the enslaved. The plantation lady projected her fear and failure onto her daughter. Both sought to cleanse themselves through domination. But power cannot cleanse, it only conceals. The daughter's obesity, so despised by her mother, was in a dark way the most honest thing in that house. It was the body telling the truth the soul refused to speak. And there is something deeply philosophical in that. The way the body carries the burdens the mind denies. History remembers the acts, but before every act comes a sickness of the soul, a moral distortion that seeps slowly through generations until it becomes visible in the flesh. That is what happened in that family. The daughter's body was the surface on which centuries of denial wrote their final confession. When she was led to the barn, she was no longer seen as a person. She had become an object, a vessel for shame, a body to be punished for daring to exist beyond control. But in that act of violence, the plantation lady revealed more than cruelty. She revealed the death of illusion. Because after that night, no amount of wealth, no sermon, no southern etiquette could disguise what had taken root. The grandeur of the plantation was built on the same rotting foundation that consumed that young woman's life. Excess without empathy, power without accountability. The daughter's body, left lifeless in the barn, became more than a corpse. It became a prophecy. It foretold the end of a world that could no longer sustain its lies. For when a society begins to consume its own children to preserve its illusions, it has already signed its death sentence. The plantation lady believed she was preserving her legacy. In truth, she buried it. And if we step back from that time and look at our own, we must ask, how different are we? Do we not still live in systems that feed on others' exhaustion, that demand perfection while punishing those who cannot perform it? Do we not still value appearance over compassion, image over truth? The plantation is gone, but the hunger that built it still breathes. Only now it hides behind new names. The daughter's body teaches us something essential. When a society refuses to face its moral sickness, the sickness finds another way to speak. It will show itself in our institutions, our relationships, our bodies, our history. And unless we confront it with truth and humility, it will consume us just as surely as it consumed her. Because decay never begins with weakness, it begins with denial. And the daughter's body, shamed and sacrificed, was simply the South's denial made visible. Power, when it is left unchecked, does something peculiar to the human soul. It begins to reshape the very definition of morality. The plantation lady was not born a monster. She was made by a world that worshipped hierarchy as holiness. From birth, she was taught that power was not only her right, but her divine inheritance. To own was to be blessed, to command was to be chosen. And over time, that belief did something irreversible. It severed her from compassion. She began to see her authority not as stewardship, but as destiny. The deeper she sank into that illusion, the more God and power became indistinguishable in her mind. That is how cruelty becomes justified, not through rage or impulse, but through conviction. By the time she stood in her great house overlooking the fields, she no longer questioned her actions. Her voice had the calm certainty of someone who believed they were preserving divine order. She would quote scripture when giving orders, invoke providence when punishing slaves, and tell herself that her discipline was mercy disguised as pain. Her plantation was her kingdom, and she its god. And like all false gods, she required sacrifice. That is why, when her daughter's body became an affront to her pride, she turned to the only theology she truly understood: control through humiliation. She did not see her daughter as flesh and blood, she saw her as disobedience embodied. In her mind, sin demanded purification, and she alone held the authority to cleanse it. This is the twisted psychology of power. It makes destruction feel like duty. The plantation lady believed she was saving the order of her world, but what she was really doing was revealing the sickness of her soul. A sickness cultivated by years of unchallenged authority and a lifetime of moral insulation. Every day on the plantation was a rehearsal for that night in the barn. Her orders, her punishments, her cold silences, each one a small act of desensitization. When you control others long enough, you lose the ability to see them as human. The enslaved were no longer people to her, they were instruments, extensions of her will. Her daughter's suffering did not touch her, because she had already practiced indifference for decades. She had learned to confuse silence for peace, fear for obedience, and submission for harmony. And so, when she demanded that her daughter be brought to the barn, she did not feel the weight of what she was asking. She believed she was restoring order to chaos. That belief, that certainty of righteousness, is what made her truly dangerous. Because when cruelty puts on the mask of divine purpose, it becomes almost impossible to see as cruelty. History is full of such figures, leaders, preachers, rulers, who cloak their violence in virtue. The plantation lady was simply one of them, a woman shaped by a system that taught her to mistake dominance for destiny. But the psychology of her cruelty goes deeper still. Power did not only blind her to the suffering of others, it blinded her to her own weakness. Behind her composure, she was terrified. Terrified of losing respect, of losing control, of facing the truth that her authority was built on fear, not reverence. The larger her power grew, the smaller her soul became, and so she clung to the only thing that still made her feel alive: command. To her, to order was to exist. Without obedience beneath her, she felt invisible. That is why the slightest rebellion, even from her own daughter, felt like a threat to her very identity. She could not reason with it. She had to destroy it. The barn, then, was not merely a place of punishment. It was an altar of insecurity. There she reasserted her control in the most grotesque way possible, believing that if she could force others to bend to her will, she could silence the fear that haunted her. But control can never silence fear, it only feeds it. Every act of dominance deepened her dependence on it. Like an addict, she needed to feel power to escape the emptiness it created. The more she ruled, the less she felt whole. The more she punished, the more she decayed. And that is the paradox of power when it becomes godlike. It consumes the worshipper first. The plantation lady thought she was preserving divine order, but what she really did was dethrone her own humanity. True power, the kind that sustains rather than destroys, begins with empathy. It is rooted in understanding, not domination, but she had long forgotten that. She had come to believe that compassion was weakness, that mercy invited rebellion, that fear was the only reliable language of obedience. In her pursuit of godhood, she became her own idol, worshipping control, feeding cruelty, and mistaking silence for faith. If we listen closely, her story is not merely about one woman's corruption. It is about a universal human flaw. The moment we believe we are above others, we begin to lose the capacity to love them. The moment we mistake authority for righteousness, we begin to justify anything that preserves it. The plantation lady's cruelty was not unique to her century. We still see it today, in systems, in hierarchies, in the quiet places where power hides behind noble words. It wears new clothes, but it is the same sickness, the hunger to be obeyed rather than understood. When she looked upon her daughter, she did not see a human being asking for love. She saw a reflection of her own failure, and she punished that reflection instead of facing it. That is the final stage of moral blindness, when we begin to destroy others for showing us who we really are. So yes, the plantation lady was cruel, but her cruelty was only the surface of something deeper. The delusion that power can make one pure, that domination can make one divine. She lived and died inside that illusion, never realizing that the authority she thought was sacred was, in truth, her undoing. And perhaps that is the message her story leaves us, that any power divorced from empathy will always turn on itself. You can build kingdoms, you can command obedience, you can silence dissent. But the moment you play God, you begin to die as a human being. The story of that night cannot be told fully without speaking of the men who were forced to take part in it. 3 enslaved men whose names history forgot, though their silence still echoes louder than words ever could. They were not chosen because of who they were, but because they were property. Bodies without rights, instruments of the mistress's will. Yet, within that horrifying command lay one of the deepest tragedies of the human condition, that even the enslaved, already broken by a system of domination, could be coerced into becoming participants in someone else's suffering. Their silence was not consent, it was survival, and that silence reveals more about the true cost of slavery than any document, any record, or any monument ever could. Imagine the weight of that moment. These were men who had spent their lives in bondage, their bodies used, their spirits controlled, their humanity constantly denied. They had been trained to obey, to suppress every instinct of resistance, because defiance on a plantation was not simply punished, it was extinguished. Now, standing in that barn, they were commanded to commit an act that defied the last remnants of their own moral being. They were forced to become instruments of humiliation against another human being who, though free by law, was trapped in the same machinery of cruelty that bound them. In that moment, the boundaries between master and victim dissolved, and all that remained was degradation. We often speak of slavery as physical oppression, but its true purpose was psychological domination, to fracture the will until obedience became instinct. That night, the plantation lady's order did not just assert her power over the enslaved, it weaponized their obedience against their own souls. The act she forced them into was not about lust or punishment, it was about control. She wanted to remind them that even their morality was not their own. To be enslaved was not only to have your body owned, but your conscience chained. In that barn, they stood on the edge of a terrible paradox. To obey meant guilt, to resist meant death, and so they obeyed. But in that obedience was a kind of silent scream, a grief too deep to speak. When a man is forced to act against his soul, he begins to lose faith in the meaning of his own humanity. These men carried that weight long after that night. The knowledge that they had been turned into instruments of another's vengeance, stripped not just of their freedom but of their moral agency. That is the quiet horror of slavery. It demanded not just submission, but participation in evil. It made victims complicit in their own suffering, and sometimes in the suffering of others. It broke people from the inside out. We often imagine freedom as the absence of chains, but these men teach us something harder, that even without chains, a person can remain imprisoned by what they were forced to do to survive. Their silence was not emptiness, it was full of unspeakable memory. And what of the daughter standing before them, humiliated, broken? She was as powerless as they were. The barn made equals of them in pain. The plantation lady's cruelty did something she never intended. It erased the very hierarchy she lived to preserve. For in that moment, there were no masters, no slaves, no distinctions of race or class. There was only suffering, only the terrible truth that power, when abused long enough, dehumanizes everyone it touches. The lady, the daughter, the enslaved, each was imprisoned in the same darkness, though by different means. This is why history must be spoken not as a sequence of events, but as a moral mirror. Those 3 men were not faceless. They were human beings, each with their own stories, their own families, their own faint hopes of freedom. But the world they lived in erased those stories, reducing them to shadows in another's narrative. That is what the plantation system did best. It erased. It turned people into instruments, memories into silence, guilt into inheritance. And yet, if we listen carefully, there is something sacred in that silence. It speaks of endurance. It speaks of the strength to survive when one's humanity has been stripped bare. Those men, despite the horror of what they were forced to do, remained witnesses to the truth. They saw what power really was, not strength, but sickness. They bore the evidence of it in their silence, in the way they kept moving, kept breathing, kept existing in a world that denied their existence. There is a kind of dignity in that endurance, a tragic, quiet dignity, because survival itself became an act of resistance. Every day they lived was a defiance of the system that tried to erase them. They could not speak their truth, but they carried it in their eyes, in their stillness, in the way they refused to break completely. They were witnesses to the plantation's corruption, and though history forgot their names, it could not erase their truth. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of this story, that the ones who suffered most were also the ones who understood most clearly what humanity truly meant. They had been denied everything, and yet within them burned the smallest, purest form of moral awareness. The refusal to forget what right and wrong truly were, even when they were powerless to act on it. That is why their silence matters. It was not the silence of submission, but the silence of survival. It was the silence that carries knowledge too painful for words. The knowledge of what happens when one human being owns another, and when obedience becomes a weapon sharper than any whip. So when we remember that barn, we must remember them, not as shadows in someone else's story, but as the last honest witnesses of a system that consumed itself. They were made to participate in evil they did not choose, yet they remained human in the only way they could, by enduring it. Their silence is not absence, it is testimony. And it should remind us, even now, that silence in the face of injustice is never neutral. It either preserves cruelty or resists it. The difference lies in whether we choose to speak once we are free. In the aftermath of that night, the plantation fell eerily quiet, as if the land itself was ashamed of what it had witnessed. The barn still stood, the same wooden beams, the same scent of hay and dust, but something in its silence had changed. It was no longer a place of labor, nor a storage of harvest. It had become a monument to what unchecked power does when it no longer fears the judgment of God or man. The plantation lady, once revered for her refinement, became a ghost among her own walls, and her daughter, hidden from sight, became a living reminder that cruelty, when born in the human heart, never remains contained. It consumes everything around it, even the one who wields it. There's a strange truth about human suffering. It never disappears, it transforms. What happened that night in the barn did not end there. It seeped into the lives of everyone who touched it. The mother, the daughter, the 3 enslaved men, even the land that bore witness. Suffering of that magnitude always finds a way to live on. It hides in the bloodline, in the whispers of descendants, in the quiet unease of places that remember. You can bury the memory, but you cannot bury its energy. And in that way history is never past. It is present, living within us in ways we rarely recognize. The plantation lady, in her arrogance, believed she could control everything. The bodies of her slaves, the dignity of her daughter, even the narrative of what was right and wrong. But history has a way of humbling tyrants. In trying to erase her shame through cruelty, she only deepened it. Her attempt to assert control became her unraveling. Power, when detached from conscience, always ends this way. It turns inward, devouring the very soul that wields it. She thought she could dictate the terms of humiliation, but in truth, she became its author and its victim. Every act of evil carries within it the seed of its own destruction. What's striking here is how the human psyche seeks justification for cruelty. She likely told herself that she was teaching a lesson, enforcing discipline, protecting the reputation of her house. That's how evil often disguises itself, not as monstrous intent, but as moral necessity. And that's what makes it so dangerous. We don't destroy others in the name of hate. We destroy them in the name of righteousness, in the name of order, in the name of what we believe to be deserved. The plantation lady was not just a cruel woman. She was a reflection of a society that baptized its sin with the language of morality. The aftermath of that act revealed the deeper sickness of the entire system. The enslaved men could not speak of what they were forced to do, for fear of death. The daughter could not name what had been done to her, for fear of shame. And the mother could not face what she had done, for fear of judgment. Silence became the only shared language between them. And that silence, heavy, suffocating, unbroken, is how generational trauma begins. Because what cannot be spoken becomes inherited. The body remembers what the tongue denies. There's something deeply psychological in that truth. Every society that refuses to confront its past ends up repeating it, not because it wants to, but because it cannot heal what it refuses to see. The plantation system may have died on paper, but its psychology, the belief that some lives are lesser, that domination can be justified, still lingers in the architecture of modern life. What began in the barn now hides in the corners of institutions, in the quiet prejudices of culture, in the ways we still measure worth by power and skin. That's the shadow we have inherited, the moral residue of a world that called cruelty civilization. And yet, amid all this darkness, there remains a chance for redemption. History, as brutal as it is, does not speak to condemn us. It speaks to awaken us. The truth of that night, if we dare to look at it, invites us to confront the hidden parts of ourselves. The capacity for cruelty, for silence, for indifference. Because while we may no longer live on plantations, the human heart is still capable of building them. In our homes, our politics, our relationships, whenever we treat another person as less than human. The barn is not just a place in Georgia, it is a symbol of what happens when the soul forgets compassion. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not what was done, but how easily it could be forgotten. The records vanish, the land is sold, the descendants change their names, but the energy remains, waiting for someone brave enough to speak it aloud. And in speaking it, something begins to heal. Because truth, though painful, is the only light powerful enough to pierce the darkness of denial. What happened in that barn is not simply history. It is a warning, a mirror held up to every generation that dares to believe itself more enlightened than the last. To tell this story is not to indulge in horror, but to remind ourselves what humanity becomes when conscience is silenced. The plantation lady thought she owned her slaves. In the end, it was her cruelty that owned her. She became the prisoner of her own heart, trapped in a cycle of vengeance and guilt that consumed everything she loved. That is the irony of power without empathy. It destroys its own foundation. And so, when we look back on her story, we should not do so with simple judgment, but with understanding, not to excuse her, but to recognize that the same seeds of cruelty, pride, and silence exist within all of us. History's lesson is not that monsters once walked among us, but that ordinary people, convinced of their righteousness, are capable of monstrous things. In the quiet of that barn, where pain and power collided, a terrible truth was revealed, that the line between victim and oppressor is thinner than we wish to believe, and that redemption begins only when we choose to see it. Let that truth unsettle you, let it question you. Because the true purpose of history is not to remind us of what they did, but to awaken us to what we might still become, if we are not careful.